Despite the impression given by certain segments of the audience, the current generation of TV shows and movies being produced under the banners of Star Wars and Star Trek, two of the most enduring and prolific entertainment franchises ever, has mostly been embraced by fans. I realize indicators like box office grosses, social media buzz, and the consensus opinions of professional critics, even when taken together, aren't definitive, of course, but if a movie or a show is a commercial and a critical success, that's probably a sign that more people like it than don't like it. Not everyone likes the new stuff. That's to be expected. Art is subjective. A great film to me might be a lousy film to you, and that's fine. But when we're talking about new entries in long-running franchises, there's a particular type of objection that comes up from time to time. This type of objection is made by fans who are fixated not so much on the stories or the characters of these franchises, but on the lore, the fictional histories of the story worlds, that which we usually call the canon. I've thrown more than my share of mockery at these fans over the years, and I'm sure I will continue to do so every now and then in the future, but I don't want to do that in this video. This time, I want to examine one particular subset of these disgruntled canon fanatics, what their complaints are, and how those complaints can help the rest of us, and maybe even some of them, look at the concept of canon in a more interesting and useful way. I'm talking about the fans who get upset when the official canon of their favorite franchise conflicts with the expanded universe. And since the term expanded universe was popularized by the Star Wars franchise, it's only fitting that the best example of a fan backlash related to the canonicity of expanded universe works took place within the Star Wars fandom. It started in 2014, the year before the release of the first film in the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens. When we talk about the expanded universe, we're referring to things like novels, comics, video games, audio dramas, in some cases animated series that are licensed by those who control the franchise, that tell stories which feature established characters and are intended to take place in the same universe as the movies and TV shows. Expanded universe works typically go beyond what is established in the official canon, but stop short of contradicting it. In terms of canonicity, we might describe them as being more than fan fiction, but less than fully canonical. And for a big chunk of the history of Star Wars, the expanded universe was the only place where fans could go to get new stories. 16 years went by between Return of the Jedi and The Phantom Menace. During that time, there were hundreds of novels and comics and other expanded universe works published, works that not only told stories that took place in between the films in the original Star Wars trilogy, but that also showed what happened to Luke Skywalker, Leia, Han Solo, and the rest of our heroes after the events of Return of the Jedi. In fact, a lot of the Star Wars Expanded Universe stuff was set post-Return of the Jedi, including some of the most popular novels and comics. In these stories, we see our heroes from the original trilogy fighting the remnants of the fallen galactic empire and helping to establish a new republic. We see Luke Skywalker recruiting and training a new generation of Jedi while also struggling with the ongoing temptation of the dark side of the Force. We see Han Solo and Leia Organa getting married and having kids, 3 kids, actually, twins Jaina and Jason, and their younger brother, Anakin. Besides introducing new heroes like Han and Leia's kids and Mara Jade, who became one of the most beloved characters in the expanded universe, and providing more of a showcase for minor characters from the films like Wedge Antilles, the expanded universe also introduced memorable new villains like Grand Admiral Thrawn, who is the main antagonist of the Thrawn trilogy, one of the most celebrated and influential works in the expanded universe. The Star Wars Expanded Universe not only honored the canon that had been established in the feature films produced up to that point, it maintained a kind of canon of its own. The various stories that fell under the Expanded Universe umbrella mostly acknowledged each other, and rarely did the events of one contradict those of another. By the time Lucasfilm began developing the trilogy of prequel films in the mid-1990s, the Expanded Universe had become so popular that the studio actually directed the authors of the Expanded Universe not to set stories in the same time period during which the prequels would be set, to avoid any inconsistencies between those films and the Expanded Universe. This state of coexistence between the established on-screen canon of the live-action films and the deuterocanon of the Expanded Universe came to an end after Disney purchased Lucasfilm and began developing its own films and TV series that would be set following Return of the Jedi. In 2014, Lucasfilm announced that the Expanded Universe was to be rebranded as Star Wars Legends and would not be considered canon as the franchise resumed producing new live-action projects. Some fans, who had grown accustomed to the Expanded Universe being regarded as, if not quite canon, at least the next best thing to it, flipped out. They said they felt disrespected. They accused the new owners of Star Wars of not understanding the fan base, or worse yet, having contempt for the fan base. They wondered bitterly why the creators of the new Star Wars films couldn't work with what the Expanded Universe had established, build on it, or at least alongside it, instead of tearing it down. I must tell you, when this happened, I felt very little sympathy for the fans who were upset by it. Not because I personally don't really care whether a given work is canon or not, although that is definitely true. The reason I wasn't moved by the plight, if I can even call it that, of these aggrieved Star Wars Expanded Universe fans is that I'm first and foremost a Star Trek fan. And Star Trek fans have known that was the deal with our Expanded Universe all along. In Star Trek, the Expanded Universe is usually referred to collectively as the Beta Canon. The Alpha Canon consists of the Star Trek TV and streaming series and the movies. There was a time when the canonicity of Star Trek the Animated Series was questionable, but that seems to have passed. The Beta Canon consists of pretty much everything else: novels, comics, video games, role-playing games, whatever. The big difference between the Star Wars Expanded Universe and Star Trek's Beta Canon is that the powers that be in charge of Star Trek, going back to Gene Roddenberry himself, have always explicitly defined it as not part of the canon. And to be clear, when I say the canon in regards to Star Trek, I'm referring to the Alpha Canon. It's confusing. Do you see why I don't really give a shit about this stuff? Which is not to say I never gave a shit about this stuff, or that I don't know firsthand how those salty Star Wars Expanded Universe fans felt. I did, and I do. In November 1994, Pocket Books published Federation, a Star Trek novel by Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens. Federation centers on Zephram Cochrane, the inventor of warp drive on Earth. The story spans centuries and connects Cochrane to both iconic crews of the Starship Enterprise, the one led by Captain Kirk, as seen in Star Trek the original series, and the one led by Captain Picard, as seen in Star Trek The Next Generation. I bought Federation right after it came out, read it over a weekend, and loved it. Mostly based on its own merit, but also because I read Federation not long after I saw the film Star Trek Generations, and Federation was everything Generations was not. While Generations depicted the supposedly epic meeting between Captain Kirk and Captain Picard in a way that felt half-hearted and obligatory, as though Kirk had been hastily written into an otherwise unremarkable TNG two-parter, Federation delivered a story that involved both enterprises and the entire casts of both shows taking part in the same adventure. And yet, It wasn't the sort of indulgent, over-the-top, fan service-infested crossover we might expect to see today. In fact, the two captains never actually see or even communicate with each other, nor does anyone else on either crew. The two Enterprises are able to see each other across the event horizon of a black hole that they are both positioned near in their respective time periods, and Kirk's Enterprise is able to use the time distortion caused by the black hole to transfer Cochrane to Picard's Enterprise. Even though the two generations never actually come face to face, the entire story of Federation builds to the moment when the Enterprises meet across the black hole, and both Kirk's crew and Picard's are given important roles to play along the way. It feels significant, like a crossover between classic Trek and TNG ought to feel. And it feels well thought out and artful. So, all that being the case, I was a little annoyed when 2 years later the movie Star Trek First Contact came out and overwrote most of it. Federation features a lot of backstory for Zefram Cochrane, some of which draws on material published in the Star Trek chronology by Michael and Denise Okuda, including the name of Cochrane's first warp-capable ship, the approximate date and general circumstances of that first warp flight, Cochrane's activities in the years that followed, and Cochrane's overall personality. None of this is present in First Contact. In that film, Cochrane's first warp ship is called the Phoenix, not the Bonaventure. The ship and the flight are apparently the result of a DIY project by Cochrane and his team, not an organized, well-funded program. Cochrane himself is a gruff, rugged, self-interested drunk, not a serious, principled scientist. And the first warp flight lasts only a few minutes and immediately attracts the attention of the Vulcans, while in Federation, the first warp flight lasted several months and saw Cochrane travel back and forth to the Alpha Centauri system, but included no encounters with any aliens. I was annoyed. I was 16, Federation had been my favorite Star Trek novel and one of my favorite Star Trek stories, period, for 2 years, and now this new movie was telling me it never happened, and I was annoyed. I asked myself the same questions those Star Wars fans asked after Lucasfilm officially decanonized the expanded universe. Why couldn't they base the movie on the book? What was the point of essentially creating a whole new version of Cochrane when there was a perfectly good version right there? Why'd they have to change it? What about those of us who liked Federation? Didn't it matter what we wanted? Thankfully, my disgruntled fan phase only lasted a few months, if even that long. What brought an end to it? I realized a few things. Things which continue to shape my attitude towards stories, especially those that exist as parts of larger franchises, to this day. First, I realized that I liked the movie First Contact. I liked it a lot. I liked it even though its writers had ignored the relevant material in Federation and just made up their own stuff instead. In fact, that didn't end up affecting my opinion of First Contact at all. I didn't wind up liking First Contact in spite of how it ignores Federation. I wound up liking First Contact, period. Its relationship to Federation was irrelevant. Second, I realized that I also still liked Federation, even though it had been directly contradicted by the official canon. Despite the fact that the events it depicts didn't actually happen, the work itself still has value to me. I'm still entertained and even a little inspired by it. I know sometimes I can come across like I think I'm better than this nerd shit, but I'm more than enough of a dork to be capable of being inspired by a Star Trek novel. Believe that. Third, I realized that the reason I liked both First Contact and Federation, despite them being irreconcilable with one another, despite one of them being canon and the other not, is because I thought they were each good stories in their own right. They appealed to me for the same reasons any other story I'd ever read or heard or seen appealed to me, because I cared about the characters, because I was invested in the story and wanted to see what happened next, because I felt they had something worthwhile to say. And fourth, I realized that if you like a story for its own sake, because it has compelling characters, because it draws you in, because it speaks to you in some way, then canon is at best a superfluous concept. You remember a minute ago when I said that I still liked Federation even though the story it tells didn't actually happen? The thing is, First Contact didn't actually happen either. Neither did any other Star Trek story. Neither did any Star Wars story. Neither did any work of fiction ever created in any medium since humans began making up stories. That's what makes them works of fiction. We make them up. A few years before Lucasfilm sent some Star Wars fans into fits over the expanded universe being set aside, something similar nearly happened with a certain segment of the Star Trek fandom. After the release of the 2009 Star Trek film, which features younger versions of Captain Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and the rest of the classic Trek crew, the producers of that film had to clarify that the movie took place in an alternate timeline that had been created by Nero's time travel. This clarification was deemed necessary because some fans expressed concerns that the events of the film had wiped out the previous timeline, and that, as a result, the hundreds of hours of Star Trek TV shows and movies produced before then had never happened. But even if it was the intention of the producers of the 2009 Star Trek film that Nero's time travel erased the previous timeline, and the new Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and company were not supposed to be alternate versions, but the exact same people as seen in Star Trek the original series, just going on to lead different lives as a result of the time travel shenanigans, all those old Star Trek episodes and movies would still exist. They would still have happened just as much as they did before. I've got them on DVD. They're streaming. I can watch them whenever I want. And the same is true of the old Star Wars Expanded Universe. If you loved the Thrawn trilogy, or the Dark Empire comics, or the Adventures of Han and Leia's Jedi twins, or anything else from the old Expanded Universe, those stories are still there. The question you have to ask yourself is, why did you love those stories in the first place? Was it because they spoke to you, entertained you, thrilled you, made you feel something? Or was it because they were collections of facts about the Star Wars universe? Are they stories, or are they sources of trivia? Some of you might be saying, yeah, that's great, but even if we value stories for their own sake, stories that are part of larger franchises don't happen in a vacuum, and things like canon and consistency are still important for placing stories in a larger context. That's true. But most stories that depend on other stories for their meaning or even just their comprehensibility will communicate that to you, the reader, in one way or another. Ideally, it's done elegantly, woven naturally into the text, but sometimes it can just be in the form of an author's note. For the purposes of this story, the events depicted in the novel, the truce at Bakura, are considered to have taken place, or something like that. A well-written story will tell you, either directly or indirectly, what is canon as far as that story is concerned. If it makes mention of Han and Leia having only one child, a son named Ben, you know it was written with the official canon in mind. If it references Jaina and Jason and little Anakin, you know it acknowledges a different set of events. Whatever the case, a story's place and significance in a larger context shouldn't be too difficult to figure out, especially if it's of particular importance to that story. A recent example of how this works from the Star Trek side of things, involving works in the official canon, not beta canon expanded universe stuff, but the principle is the same, is the depiction of the Gorn in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Prior to Strange New Worlds, the only significant appearances of the Gorn in canonical productions were an episode of Star Trek Enterprise, where we see a Gorn threatening the mirror universe versions of the heroes, and, most importantly, the Star Trek The Original Series episode Arena, which centers on Captain Kirk being forced into one-on-one combat with a Gorn captain on a remote planet. Not only is Arena the first episode featuring a Gorn to be produced, it also seems pretty clear that no one aboard the Enterprise has ever seen or even heard of a Gorn before. But according to Strange New Worlds, which is set roughly 10 years before the events of the original series, not only did the crew of the Enterprise see Gorn, the Gorn were a well-known, if sometimes mysterious, threat to Starfleet ships. Plus, the Gorn we see in Strange New Worlds look and act very differently than the Gorn we see in Arena. So, does that mean Arena has been negated somehow? Delegitimized? Ruined? I don't think so. It's clear from watching Arena that the crew of the Enterprise has never seen a Gorn before. So, when I watch that episode, and I really like that episode, I watch it with that assumption. I accept what the episode tells me. When I watch Strange New Worlds, where it's equally clear that the Gorn are known to this crew of the Enterprise, which includes Spock and Uhura and a few other characters who also appear on TOS as part of Kirk's crew, I watch it with that assumption. I accept what that show tells me. I don't think to myself, wait, this is wrong. They don't know about the Gorn yet. What a strange, silly thought that would be. Of course they know the Gorn. It's right there in the episode. By the same token, when I watch Arena now, I don't think, why don't they know about the Gorn? There are people on this ship who have fought the Gorn before. Because it's obvious when you watch that episode that they haven't. This sort of inconsistency would be irreconcilable if we were talking about real life. If Spock were a real person, he would have either seen a Gorn before or he wouldn't have. Arena and the Gorn-related episodes of Strange New Worlds couldn't both be true, but we're not talking about real life. We're talking about fiction. And in fiction, both can be true, and in the case of Star Trek canon, both are true. I've seen some fans insist that because of this and other inconsistencies, the original series and Strange New Worlds must take place in separate timelines, regardless of what the producers say. And look, everyone is free to interpret the shows however they want, which is another reason why canonicity is ultimately not that big of a deal. But this strikes me as a terribly reductive and literalist approach. If two stories feature the same characters and are set in the same world, and each story works on its own terms, why must we insist that the terms of one story absolutely cannot conflict with those of the other? They can both be true within the larger context of the story world because they, along with the rest of that story world, are all made up. And when I say it's all made up, I'm not saying it doesn't matter. Stories do matter. They matter as much as anything else our species is able to create. Stories engage our minds and touch our hearts and stoke our imaginations. They can distract us and they can enlighten us. They can allow us to escape to comforting fantasies, and they can enable us to confront difficult truths. And they can do all of these things, whether the entity that holds the intellectual property rights considers them canon or not. That's the most important thing expanded universes can teach us about the concept of canon, that in order to be useful at all, canon should serve stories, not the other way around. Canon should be a resource for authors and audiences, not a straitjacket. It should be flexible, malleable, and always open to interpretation and reinterpretation, and we should be open-minded and generous and adventurous enough to view it through whatever lens a given story is asking us to, so that story can succeed or fail on its own terms. The expanded universe, the beta canon, whatever particular term you want to apply to the non-canonical works of Star Wars, Star Trek, these other fictional universes into which so many of us have invested ourselves, they remind us of what really matters, of what made us love these imaginary worlds in the first place. characters, ideas, stories. They don't just show us what is as determined by the powers that be, they show us what can be. It's not about what really happened, or which bits actually count, or which stories have value and which ones don't. No one else can decide that for you anyway. That's something that you make up for yourself.